All right. In the back. In the back, sit down. Okay, so two curly-haired Jews sat at the front of the stage. So thank you so much, everybody, for coming to the first in a potential series of NationBuilder book talks. I have Sasha Issenberg with me, who's written an awesome book called The Victory Lab, The Secrets of Winning Campaigns. Has gotten a lot of great coverage, and we're really excited. He's also using NationBuilder for his book. That is a requirement of being a guest at the NationBuilder book tour.
Second Philip Roth.
Yeah. So I'm Joe Green. I'm the co-founder and president of NationBuilder, and really excited for everyone to be here. Thanks for turning out on a Monday night in downtown LA. We have a great crowd of people from campaigns, the media, employees of NationBuilder. So really excited to have everyone here. Sasha, do you want to say the initial?
No, I just want to thank Kara and Joe for helping put this together, and all of you for coming out.
So kind of the format is I'm going to ask Sasha some questions, and then at the end we'll leave some time for Q&A, and then Sasha will be here afterwards to get drunk with everybody. You're on a plane tonight, right? So you got to fall asleep for your red eyes, so you got to get you some red wine. So we've just been through this election, kind of a big deal. And one of the interesting points of your book is that you trace the history of some experiments and sort of doing A/B testing in politics in a way that people are probably more familiar with in, say, FDA drug testing. So why do you think it took politics so long to get to this sort of seemingly obvious kind of experimental technique?
So, I sort of trace the modern origins of doing campaign experiments to 1998 when two professors at Yale go out to the streets of New Haven and decide that they're going to run a randomized control trial. And so it's exactly like a pharmaceutical trial. They're randomly assigning voters to different types of political communication instead of drugs. And they take voters and put them in one of four groups. So a quarter of them get randomly assigned a get out the vote reminder, nonpartisan get out the vote reminder by mail on a postcard. A quarter of them get a call from a paid call center. A quarter of them get a visit from a canvasser in person, a grad student who's being paid. And then there's a control group that gets nothing. And then afterwards you can go look at the voter file and see who voted and who didn't. And it turns out that the people who got the phone call saw no increase in their turnout. The people who got the mail saw a small but appreciable increase in turnout. And the people who get the in-person visit see a big boost. And this was pretty radical within the academic discipline of political science because political science had basically lagged behind all the other social sciences in using field experimentation, especially randomized trials.
So they didn't really do the whole science part.
Yeah, and so there's been this sort of constant tension. There's this great quote I have in the book from Woodrow Wilson, who's when he was still at Princeton, who was the president of the American Political Science Association, was still new in like 1908, 1909. He says, politics is not really a science. It's too mystical to be measured the way that people measure, physics or whatever. But there are a couple other bigger problems with using experiments, even as economics and psychology came to understand the value of going out in the field and doing this stuff, which is there were huge investments made in survey research in the sort of post-war period, massive election studies, and so people who wanted to study elections had, academics, professors, graduate students, had access to sort of amazing reservoirs. Some of the most expensive research projects in the country have been these election surveys. And so there's plenty of stuff to study. And if you wanted to actually go and run your own experiments, you were up against sort of two problems. The campaigns and parties wanted nothing to do with academics who were interested in studying them. So you'd never really get into the world of real campaigns. And if you were relying on academic dollars, research grants, human subjects review boards, you were not going to be able to do partisan politics of any kind. And so what these guys at Yale did was that they partnered with the League of Women Voters and set up this nonpartisan get out the vote operation. But it really limited the types of things you can study. So we have this really big body of work on basically nonpartisan mobilization, GOTV stuff, and on registration. We're only now starting to sort of have experiments that are targeted at persuasion. And so that's sort of this starts in academia, migrates in, and the resistance is people in the political world who aren't interested in experiments, mostly because if you've been selling direct mail or robocalls to a campaign, there's no reason why you want somebody coming along with a scientifically credible tool for assessing the cause and effect of these things on actually increasing turnout. And so, what happens is they get their paper published in 2000, and you get this sort of remarkable moment where there are people, political consultants, who, in my experience interviewing many of them, not the type of people who, some of them know how to read, but not a lot of them focus their attention on scholarly journals. And so, but you'd have like direct mail vendors would send around a copy of this article in the American Political Science Review to say like, hey, our stuff is better than phone calls, give us some of the phone budget. And so you get this sort of petty little war for bits of a campaign budget. But at the same time, there becomes a small circle of people inside campaigns, mostly at the sort of permanent institutions at the left, labor unions, some of the women's groups like Emily's List, some of the environmental groups, that are saying, like, this is actually pretty exciting. So not only should we be paying attention to what these experiments are showing us for the first time about what really actually gets results, but we're out doing politics every year and spending a lot of money on it and want to get smarter year to year, so why don't we start running our own experiments?
So your book sort of, it kind of looks at two trends, or maybe more than two, but one of those trends is sort of the use of data to kind of really micro-target voters, and the other is this use of experimentation to kind of A/B test the techniques, I guess, that you use to contact those micro-targeted voters. So how did you see that play out in this election? You talked some about sort of Obama's effective use. How did Obama actually use it? How did Romney actually use it? And those of us like me from a field background are sort of taught that field can make it the most, maybe a 2% difference. Did we see more than that?
Sure. So, it's not a coincidence that these two sort of trends, that my story really gets going around 2000. That's when these sort of experiments first come into play, and all of a sudden, these two guys at Yale keep on doing experiments, and then they have sort of grad students, and then people in politics take notice and start running their own experiments. And that's when you have this sort of big breakthrough in political data where sort of 2001 and 2, people in politics realize that that the consumer world knows a whole lot more about their customers or prospective customers, and that they want to figure out how to get into these big commercial data warehouses and link up voter registration records to the sort of hundreds of data points that the companies that develop your credit rating scores and send you catalogs and stuff like that know about you. And so those two things are sort of separate trends, and they take place in parallel. A lot of the same people in politics are interested in both of them because you get this kind of generational divide between people who are thinking empirically about either targeting or experimentation. The Moneyball analogy kind of can't go far enough, not only for my own marketing purposes, but it's a really good sort of cultural analogy where instead of scouts and these sort of old guard front office types, you have consultants and sort of old campaign hands who are relying on a certain amount of received wisdom about what works and what doesn't.
So who's the Billy Bean and who's the Paul DePodesta?
So for the purposes of having a sort of austere narrative, there are a whole lot of innovators in this field. On the data side, the first big success in integrating this data and putting it to work is the Bush re-elect in 2004. And I tell that story through Alex Gage, who had been a Republican pollster but had spent enough time in the sort of corporate world in the 90s to understand that what companies call CRM, customer relationship management, was developing both a collection of data on people that was coming in from outside sources, but also that they were tracking their interactions with people and using it to sort of inform future interactions. And there was nothing sort of similar in the political world. And And so that was sort of the big breakthrough on the sort of data side and what it allowed campaigns to do. And basically any campaign of any size since 2006 has been operating a role, it's what we sort of collectively call micro-targeting, but it means no longer having to target individuals just based on the precinct in which they live or the sort of large demographic categories that are on your voter registration record, like your age or gender, or in some places your race or ethnicity, but party. To be able to not only have a pretty refined demographic, political, lifestyle portrait of an individual, but to run statistical models that allow you to make a lot of inferences and predictions about how likely they are to vote, who they are likely to vote for, and what they're likely to care about. And so that's sort of become the environment of the last decade, and at the same time these experiments are moving through, and 2000 becomes important in many ways. I think we didn't realize at the time how influential that election would be. It seemed like a very sort of low-stakes election in many respects. But I think it's been incredible, and the way it ended with the recount sort of overshadowed the election itself, and September 11th ended up overshadowing the sort of post-recount political environment. But it was an amazingly influential election, I think, in the sort of practice of politics, in that Americans, especially people who did politics, became convinced of two things. One is how polarized our politics had become in sort of partisan and ideological terms. I tell the story in the book of Matthew Dowd, who was Bush's chief polling advisor, who at exactly this point, 12 years ago, even before the Supreme Court had ruled in Bush v. Gore, starts writing a memo looking ahead at Bush's re-election strategy. And he dwells on one point in the exit polls, which had been something like, and we get the number wrong, but it'll be close enough, that in 1984, like 27% of Americans had reported splitting their tickets, voting for both a Democrat and Republican at some point on their ballot, and by 2000 it became like 7%. And his sort of insight was that 2004 needed to be fundamentally, overwhelmingly, if not exclusively, a mobilization election. And that meant that Republicans who had never really thought of GOTV, get out the vote stuff, as a sort of core campaign function. The joke was that Republicans, and this is in the sort of memos that were going around at the RNC at the time, was that we're the party that thinks of GOTV as get on television. That Republicans need to prepare for 2004 by being better at sort of pinpointing people who already sort of share their values, like their candidate, or on their team, part of their coalition, but are just not habitual voters, and then figuring out how you actually turn them into voters, and then also that small margin, convincing people that small investments that'll get you 1 or 2% are worth investing in, because after Florida, people started to prepare for things that they could win tight races.
A question about that. So I was on the phone earlier today with a friend of mine who was just coming off the Romney campaign, and I noticed he seemed to feel a lot like I did just coming off the John Kerry campaign. And I was asking him about, just between us, what do you really think happened? And now, of course, I'm sharing with all of you. So just, don't tell me things. In terms of technology, like how much, how do you feel about, the Obama campaign's edge that they had over you? And he said, look, the biggest advantage they had was that they had 4 years to prepare, was that they were the incumbent. And you notice, like, no incumbent has lost except Jimmy Carter, and George H.W. Bush sort of an exception because there was a three-way race. So basically, no incumbent has lost since Franklin Delano Roosevelt beat beat Hoover. And so, how much of that is just the fact that they had 4 years to prepare? Because the 2004 election, I think to a lot of people looked a lot like this election, where you had an incumbent who was very weakened, who, where everyone thought they were really vulnerable and they lost. And everybody in 2004 was talking about Republicans doing micro-targeting and using data. Now everyone's talking about Democrats doing that. And sort of, how much analogy do you see? And is that sort of reasonable, or are the Democrats actually just like way ahead?
Yeah, so I think both things are true. I think Democrats are way ahead, and we could talk a little bit about why that is. But I do think we tend to ridiculously underestimate how different presidential re-elections are from everything else that exists in politics. One of the big challenges for people trying to innovate in politics, especially in the campaign world, is breaking out of the sort of cycle of two-year campaigns, right? And so, I like to talk about how bad campaigns are. They're like the worst companies you could possibly imagine, right? So they exist for 6 months or 9 months, or in some special cases, 18 months. They will go out of business the day after the election, regardless of whether they're successful or they're a failure. The person who is running it, the CEO or chairman, the candidate, is either somebody who's done this before, in which case they think they know how to do it and will do the same thing over and over again with the same bunch of people that they did it last time, or they've never done it before, in which case there's absolutely no good reason why, if you are a county commissioner or a justice of the peace or a well-meaning, civically engaged local lawyer, you should have any idea how to run a $700,000 political marketing corporation that is your congressional campaign. And so they end up basically in hock to a circle of consultants and vendors who are often, this is being videotaped, so I won't flippantly use the word cartel, which I think is technically libelous, but you basically see the same circle of people reunite around a new candidate, and everybody's incentive is to sort of do the same thing over and over again, assuming there's enough money coming in. And there's very little incentive to try anything new or to test any assumptions. And so the morning after the campaign, when it's going out of business, very often nobody is having any rigorous look back at what worked or what didn't. I mean, I'd be curious to know, if you're a friend on the Romney campaign, was there a single meeting or conference call Wednesday morning to actually review what happened? Probably not.
Well, we all heard about Romney's calls to his donors.
Right, no, and so donor maintenance ends up being the way that you reflect on this. But this is a business with $900 million, and I would guess that nobody has any incentive, and if you're talking, nobody has incentive to run experiments, because to run an experiment you have to not only invest in the research and analysis that's not going to teach you anything till December or January, but you have to hold out a control group, which means now you're going to your campaign manager and saying, oh, here are a few 100,000 people that I don't want to contact for the benefit of learning something in a few months. And so campaigns tend to just have this cycle of doing things over and over again. And what you get there is not only that they don't learn from themselves, but you sort of ratify the inability of campaigns to honestly attribute credit or blame, right? And so I always as a journalist, like the Wednesday after the election, because I can call around my sources and in the campaign or the consultants and have a slightly more candid conversation with them about what happened than I might otherwise. And it's almost always one of two types of conversations, right? So it's either you call the winning campaign and you say, so what happened? Why'd you win? And pretty quickly you're in this, you're talking about some discrete decision that was made that person was directly involved in, right? So,
it's because the American people love them.
Well, no, but the consultants never say that. No, if you talk to the candidate, that's what it's about. But the consultant, so you call the media consultant, and you say, what happened, why'd you win? And pretty quickly you're hearing some story about, a week out, we were down, and I looked really closely in the polls, and we were getting slaughtered with married women, so I tore up our media plan for the last weekend, and we went into the studio, and I told the director I want to make one last ad, and it's going to be all pink, and we're going to go shoot the candidate in front of a house with a swing set, and we edited it all night, and we drove it to the station, and we pulled out all our other ads, and we went wall to wall with the pink houses ad for the last weekend of the campaign. By Tuesday, we've closed the gap with married women, and we pulled it out. Okay. And then you call the speechwriter or the communications director, you hear the story of this great zinger that they wrote in some radio debate that nobody listened to, but totally changed the terms of the voters' decisions. And you call the advance person who sets up the events, and you hear some story about how 6 weeks out, we stopped going to diners and we only started visiting pumpkin patches, and by the end we killed it with the pumpkin patch vote. And then you call the people in the losing campaign, and you're so what happened? Why'd you lose? And so I was the candidate sucks. She wouldn't raise any money. It was the worst year to be a Republican. The economy was horrible. And you realize that there's a fundamental inability for anybody involved in these things to learn anything. And when you're in a presidential re-election campaign, that changes. And so you can lay out a 4-year research arc. This didn't just happen in 2000, but 4 years ago, There were people who were kept back in Chicago as part of a post-election task force that did an amazingly rigorous review of everything that the campaign did, at not insignificant costs, keeping these people on payroll for weeks, keeping the headquarters open. But there was and those documents still inform everything they did until 10 days ago. And but it laid out, it's the sort of rare moment when a campaign can start to think like a corporation. Okay, we're going to be around for 4 years, we're going to control a national party, we can muck around in all these local races, we can use county and state parties as sort of testing grounds, and we have a sense of what our budget will be over 4 years. We're not going to have a primary, and we can start to learn things. And the Bush folks took that seriously. They ran this thing called the 72-hour program, which was over 60 experiments, not academically rigorous, but going to try and actually sort of test some of their assumptions, especially about mobilization, and then sort of investing in this micro-targeting stuff. And the Kerry campaign ended up being sort of closer in 2004 than I think a lot of people give it credit for. This underlying insight of micro-targeting, which is we can go out and take consumer data and then use it to inform individual level profiles of voters, was something that people on the left who were doing data got. The big problem there, and I write about how Ken Strasma, who is sort of Kerry's top targeting analyst, and Mark Mellman, who was the campaign's pollster, were building a big database of all the interviews that Mellman had done, but they had trouble getting the campaign manager to pay attention to it, and they, while the Bush folks and the RNC basically told their state directors and their field directors, okay, we're doing it this way, and you will be judged on your success in using our new targeting methods. There was never really any, buy-in at the top level of the Kerry campaign. So they had a retreat for state directors, and Strasma got like 30 minutes to talk about this radically different way of targeting voters. And so there's a lot of people in the states who never used it. And there is a huge advantage, but that should not obscure the extent to which the left broadly has a massive sophistication advantage when it comes to data, analytics, and field.
And do you think what do you credit that advantage to? I mean, I've heard some people argue, well, the left gets better talent because creative, smart people are on the left. I've heard people argue that, well, it doesn't matter as much for the right because their voters turn out more reliably, so field just isn't as much in their sort of necessity. They work more through coalitions. I'm curious, what do you attribute that difference to?
So I think there are two separate things here. They've ended up coming together very well in the Obama world because there's been a very good sort of consilience of thinking intelligently about field and thinking intelligently about data and analytics, but they have two separate sort of patrimonies. On the field side, I mean, there is a rational reason why the right has spent less time investing in field and mobilization. The sort of core parts of the Republican coalition voted at a higher rate than the core parts of the Democratic coalition. So there are far more gains for Democrats, especially focusing on young people, minorities, unmarried women, which are basically traditionally the most underperforming parts of the electorate. You get more gains by mobilizing them. And then there's this kind of culture of field thing that grows out of the fact that historically there have been very few overwhelmingly Republican precincts in this country. And so in the sort of old pre-micro-targeting mode of targeting precincts, you could find if you went around the country looking for 70% Republican, 70% Democrat precincts, you'd find a lot of them. Big cities, college towns, some sort of liberal inner ring suburbs. If you went around looking for 70% Republican precincts, you'd find very few of them. This is still true. And where you do find them will be in Idaho or like maybe the presidential level, Northwest Arkansas, and you'll have to drive 20 minutes from door to door. And so you're not going to develop a canvassing culture. And so people who come up on Democratic campaigns almost always, and this is true of the people at the highest levels of Democratic politics now, probably somewhere in the recesses of their memory of their earliest campaigns were spent knocking on doors. And there are far fewer people in Republican politics who have that. And there's been a sort of, because of that, there's been people rise in field on the Democratic side in a way that they don't on the Republican side. So I was out trying to do some reporting this fall in between talking about the book, and you'd go into states and you'd meet the person on the Democratic side, the Obama state director or field director, and almost always it was somebody who was 28 or 32 or had done this like through 3 cycles, either in that state or elsewhere, but it's, I was field director for the gubernatorial campaign in 06, and then I ran the coordinated campaign here in 08, and then I did this. And you go meet the person on the Republican side, and it's like a 23-year-old who had been like president of their CRs, and is like a smart person and is really ambitious, but I'm pretty sure that what they were told was, okay, do this for 6 months, and then you'll get a job like with the state party, or you can go work on the Hill and you'll never have to go knock on doors again. And so there's very little institutional memory that's being developed on the right when it comes to field. And more importantly, I think there's very little sense of craft. There's very little sense that this is something you can do well or you can do poorly, that this is something that you can do in a way that's informed by pretty sophisticated research. And so right off the bat, I think that Republicans just fundamentally don't take mobilization in field seriously.
I think you also have to look at the Analyst Institute, right?
Yeah.
So if folks don't know, the Analyst Institute has been around, I don't know how long.
2006, 7.
Yeah, so I was part of it in 06, and it's like a brain trust on the left for this kind of experimental design and outreach. And I mean, its impact is now huge, I think, across multiple levels of the left.
Right, and so that takes us to sort of the data analytics side of it, and there I think that I think the big gains were to be found in the first half of the first decade of the century, between 2000 and 2005 or 6, from political people looking to the corporate world. And this had been this sort of like long-standing trope going back to the 50s, where campaigns said we should be more like Madison Avenue in selling our products, and there was always this sort of rightful envy that corporations were just far better at selling stuff than campaigns were, and far more rigorous about it. And so the sort of big gains that happen, sort of come into full flower with the Bush reelect, are based on some form of sort of arbitrage between how political people market and how corporate people market. Most of those gains were realized by 2005 or 6. The left wasn't as far behind in 2004 as people thought. In many respects, the left had not only caught up, but by 2006, I think sort of was ahead of the right in terms of using statistical modeling to predict voter attitudes. The biggest breakthroughs in the last 5 or 6 years have come from randomized testing, particularly informed by the social sciences, and which not only is yielding insights, discrete insights from particular tests, but it's a fundamentally different way of thinking about what you can measure. So micro-targeting is basically taking a lot of things that we know about somebody and using them to put them in a segment, classifying them based on their like visible attributes. Experiments are about seeing what campaigns can do to people and seeing who actually responds to them, which is it's the difference between basically clinical observation and going out and doing trials. And when you integrate all the data that we know about somebody with the experimental method, then you're not just looking at that first test I was describing in New Haven was just looking at the average treatment. Oh, okay, the average treatment of people get the mail goes up 1%. The average treatment of the mail 1 point. The average treatment of the people get the phone call goes up 8. But when you know 1,000 data points about each of those people, you can model the attributes of the people who respond. And that is the major breakthrough that's taking place. And there's nothing institutionally like the Analyst Institute on the left, but there's also just not a culture of experimentation. On the right, there's also just not a culture of experimentation on the right. And the point that will come back to talent is not that I don't think that there are plenty of smart people who are conservative, who are good with data and analytics, but this is a little flip, but the fact is that if you are a conservative who is good with data and analytics, you're probably like working at Deutsche Bank. And I write a little bit in the book about Dan Wagner in the context of the 08 campaign, who's the director of analytics on the Obama campaign. There was a piece in the LA Times a week ago about the Obama analytics shop that had a picture of him, at least the online version did. And I tell the story of how he walked into an Obama campaign office in 2007. He'd been working for an economic consulting firm in Chicago. He'd studied econometrics as an undergraduate, and He never worked on a campaign before, and he was sort of taken by Obama, and he ends up being given basically a data entry job in Iowa, and within 18 months he's doing some amazing things with statistical modeling, basically individual level forecasting, the same types of tools he'd used in the private sector, and he ends up going to the DNC as their targeting director and just led a 54-person analytics department that did some really amazing things. And he's now probably the most important person in data on the Democratic side. If Dan Wagner believed that the top marginal tax rate should be 4 points lower than he does, he'd probably be on Wall Street and would have happily gotten his political rocks off writing a check to a super PAC. And but so I do think that there's a sense in which you have smart people on the left are being pulled into campaigns and institutions in a way that smart people on the right are not being pulled into the sort of the world of electioneering.
So I want to, the first sort of third or so of your book kind of takes us back to an earlier part of history, which I want to dive into a little bit. So, when you're talking about micro-targeting, you're basically talking about, as I understand it, is essentially, instead of doing a small poll which just tells you, okay, these kind of people support you, you actually do a much, instead of polling a few thousand people, you poll 50,000 people. And that gives you, because then you can do these full crosstabs and get much deeper into specific data. This was enabled by when the census started to sort of have census block size of data, right? So I can look at somebody in a very specific area. So you talk about the in 1974 the NCEC as sort of the first kind of effort, at least on the left, to create this consolidated voter file. You sure it wasn't the NBEC? Come on, NationBuilder Joe? Come on. Come on, people. So the NCEC, the National Committee for an Effective Congress, kind of came out of Eleanor Roosevelt. Can you talk about sort of what they did? What were these three kind of main numbers that they were tracking? And then how did we change from that to sort of the newer method?
Yeah, so...
If you would ever use NCEC data, you wouldn't pay attention.
So the basic challenge of every campaign going back forever has been how to sort voters. In an ideal world, a campaign would go and individually survey every voter to see who they were going to vote for and how likely they were to vote and what they cared about, and then use that to basically engage in the fundamental sorting that a campaign does, which is the first thing you basically do as a campaign, and journalists write horribly about this, is you decide who you're not going to talk to.
Right.
And so you decide people who are definitely going to vote for you, people who are never going to vote for you, and people who are highly unlikely to vote, and you want to push them out of your thoughts as quickly as you can. And then people who are left, you want to classify into one of two categories. You want to take people who are likely to vote, but are not necessarily have not necessarily made up their minds. These could be people who are showing up as undecideds in polls because they're actually undecided, or they could be people who are soft supporters of your opponent that you think you can win over, or soft supporters of yours that you think you need to shore up from defecting. And then the other category of people are people who already like you, already support you, but are just not regular voters. And there, you need to turn them out. It's a difference between changing somebody's opinion and modifying their behavior fundamentally.
So persuasion versus
mobilization or turnout, right? Exactly. And so the question every campaign has is, I'm never going to be able to interview everybody in the electorate to classify them into these categories because I don't have enough volunteers, or I don't have enough money for paid phone banks or paying canvassers to get to everybody in my universe. And now it's harder and harder, even when you do have those volunteers paid people, to get people to actually answer their phone or complete a survey by phone or at the door or whatever. So the question is, what assumptions can we make about people that we haven't talked to so that we can intelligently sort them into these categories, so that if we have to go out and persuade people, if we need to persuade people to reach our numbers, we're going after the right people, and if we're indiscriminately mobilizing people that we've never talked to before, we're not mobilizing we're unlikely to be mobilizing our opponent's supporters.
The old knocking.
Right, and so you want to have a real confidence when you're knocking and dragging that they're your people. And so, I have a quote from Abraham Lincoln in the book. In 1840, he's coming back from a Whig Party conference convention, and he tells his precinct captains in Illinois, like, you shall check regularly on the voters who have not yet committed to see if their opinions have changed, and you shall monitor those who support you. It's like really good canvassing instructions. The question for the last 170 years has been, how do you intelligently marshal information that can, so that it doesn't just reside in the minds of precinct captains who remember, oh, Jack always votes Whig, we don't need to worry about him, and and so will only vote if the union tells him to vote. And so NCEC represents the first effort to sort of marshal early power of sort of punch card computing to organize data about the electorate. And so the organization starts in the late 1940s with Eleanor Roosevelt and Arthur Schlesinger and some other sort of Cold War liberal types who are decide to create a PAC to support liberals running for Congress, and they just give big checks to liberal Democrats around the country. And after Watergate, the first generation, or that generation of campaign finance reforms makes it impossible to just give people big checks running for Congress. And so they started to think, what can we do to help liberals who are running for Congress around the country that's not giving them money? And they come up with the idea that we should be a repository of sort of tactical guidance for them. And at that point, voter files are highly decentralized, and nobody even would have the computing power to sort through, 80 million records or whatever the total number of adults eligible adults in the U.S. would have been then. But there is an idea that we can organize precinct-level data, which is, in a country with a secret ballot, the smallest unit at which you actually know how people voted. And so you have a few hundred people who vote in a precinct in a high-level election, and the idea is that if we can come up with a history of how each precinct is voted, it'll offer a very good sort of first mechanism at sorting voters out, that we can identify strong Democratic precincts, and there, if we just want to knock and drag everybody at the door, we'll do fine because we'll make it up on margins. We'll identify strong Republican precincts, and we'll never go there because the risk is too high. And then we'll have people in the middle, and we will actually focus our volunteer or paid contact energy on individually talking to as many of those people as we can to sort of know whether we need to persuade them or mobilize them. So this ends up being a ridiculously arduous task in the 1970s to go out and collect history on how every precinct votes in the country, because the stuff is being kept often like handwritten at county courthouses and local registrars.
That's like it is now, isn't it?
And so they have to go around and collect all this data and then update it every time there's another election somewhere, because you need to have a sort of complete history. And then every 10 years or sometimes more frequently, people redraw the lines, and then you have to actually reallocate all of these votes because one precinct moved from a different congressional district, all this stuff. And they complete this task in a few years, and it becomes this sort of amazing resource for Democrats and unions, and helps to build a generation of liberal field organizers who understand the value of data to start making these, that they no longer have to rely on precinct captains who know everybody's name and remember whether or not they're likely to vote, but that you can start to, in a sort of orderly way, sort through the electorate and make assumptions about people. And they overlay, the census gets a lot better in 1990 with ZIP+4 information, so now you can start to get pretty good information about the socioeconomic status or household types of an area, and you can, even if you, at the individual level, all I know is the information's on your registration form. Democrats still don't have a national voter file. Republicans finished theirs around 1989, in large part because they had more control over their state parties. And so the RNC could basically compel state parties to share their data, whereas in a lot of states, one of the ways that state Democratic Party chairs kept their influence was that they controlled the voter file, and that meant that they could sell it to candidates, or they could use it as a sort of plum in a primary that they could withhold it from outsiders or give it to incumbents. Still, in Illinois, the state voter file is controlled by the Speaker of the House, who basically has it's one of the great assets if you're a Democrat running in the state, and you need to sort of win his favor. And it's a way that sort of party machines have replicated themselves even when there's not a lot of traditional patronage to give out. And so NCEC sort of changes this because now people realize that they can sort of go in and start making their own sort of assumptions about how to organize. And that becomes the sort of basis for the sort of political data apparatus until that sort of consumer information comes into play.
So basically the way they used to use it is they would classify precincts as either, if I remember correctly, there were sort of these three numbers, right? There was how, what's the average percentage it performs for Democrats in the case of NCEC. The second number is how much does that change over time? So that's sort of the persuasion index. And then what's the turnout index? What percent of people actually turn out? Right. So they use that to sort on a precinct basis which precincts to target. And then the fundamental change was that we then moved to a micro-targeting world where I didn't have to go at the precinct level.
And we still want right, exactly. And what's happened is basically just the unit has shrunk down to the individual. We still want the same index basically applies now. So the Obama campaign and all sorts of folks on the left come up with individual scores. These are percentage probabilities that a support score is a percentage likelihood that you will support Barack Obama. Turnout score is a percentage likelihood that you would turn out to vote. There are scores on particular issues. It's the same fundamental idea, right? So if under the NCEC scores, a precinct has a 69% Democratic support index, that means that the Democrats should expect to get 69 out of 100 votes there. The way the Obama campaign thinks about what their support score is that if I mobilize 100 people who have 69 Obama support scores, Obama will get 69 votes at the end of the day. So fundamentally, the logic's entirely the same. You're still getting the same type of triage, identifying people you need to mobilize and people you need to persuade based on the range of scores that they're in. You've just now moved down the unit to the individual, which means the way politics basically worked until 2000 was that you'd look at the map and you say, okay, here are precincts where we are not going. Here are precincts where we're going to just indiscriminately mobilize people, and here are precincts where we're going to do a little more surgical talking to people. And if you were in a media market that got TV ads, great, but otherwise you were sort of cut out of the sort of political universe because campaigns did not know enough about you to make an informed assumption about whether they should interact with you. Now, individual level targeting means that the campaign can say, okay, we're only at 30% in this precinct, but we can go pick out 4 people on a block there that we want to mobilize, and it's dramatically changed not only targeting but field, because now if you have a couple of volunteers in a county that you don't do well in, you can actually put them to good use as opposed to saying we're just not going to do anything in that area because it's unfavorable to us.
So you write about a guy named computer scientist named Jonathan Robbins in 1974 using zip codes to create 40 clusters with fun names like Furs and Station Wagons and Norma Rayville. And this sort of sounds a lot like soccer moms in 1996, NASCAR dads in 2004. So what has changed? Like, is this an evolution, or is there something that's like fundamentally changed in terms of this like data targeting?
Yeah. So Jonathan Robbins was a guy who basically analyzed the census to come up with these clusters. And so Claritas was the brand, which was a sort of a huge thing. Remains sort of influential in consumer marketing. And so the idea was he looked at the attributes of census tracts and then lumped them together by sort of consumer lifestyle attributes, and then came up with that number changed. I think at some point it got up to like in the 60s different categories with these sort of fun names. And it was really useful because if you were Home Depot, you wanted to find a place where there were a lot of people who had pools and patios. And so he would combine census information about household size and income with some other private sector data, and you especially for stores for citing or catalogs. So, if you're LL Bean and you want to figure out where to send catalogs, he would neatly package. One of these would be, backpacks and hiking boots or something, and you'd find rural areas where people have high disposable income and are relatively well educated, and Through survey data, you know that they do outdoorsy stuff, and that way, you know, LL Bean could decide we're just going to send stuff into these zip codes or these census tracts. There was this obsession with translating this into politics in the same way that there was this has been this obsession with doing soccer moms or NASCAR dads, that there's some idea that the kind of key to better targeting is through consumer profiling. And there were efforts throughout the 70s and 80s to figure out how to apply this to politics. And they never were really as influential as people hoped they would be, in part because often they never cut better for political. I mean, at the core of what you want to predict in politics is how likely is somebody to vote for my candidate? How likely are they to vote? How likely are they to have a position on one of the few issues I care about? And to answer the first question, which is the most important one, the best predictor of how a neighborhood's going to vote is how it's voted in the past, especially in a general election, where you have partisanship, which tends to cut pretty neatly. And at the individual level, how likely is somebody to vote? It's like their party registration, whether they vote in primaries. And so people kept on trying to find ways to fit these things into politics by polling samples in these various clusters, and it turns out that they never cut better than fine. So like 64% of people in pools and patios vote Republican, but you can often like look at the precinct and say they're in a 67% Republican precinct. Like, what are you telling me that I don't know through a cheaper, more direct means? The other big problem with them, which sort of revealing, I think, of one of the other sort of disconnects between consumer data and political data, is that they didn't directly deal with race, because people in corporations felt it entirely taboo to talk about their customer bases in racial terms. And yet everybody in politics talks about race all the time because it's a pretty basic fact of like political demography. And I tell a story of, very briefly in the book, about this guy Tom Bonnier, who's one of the Democrats' top targeters. He was at NCEC for quite a while. He would get invited into these meetings where the Claritas people would come pitch their product, and he'd be like, you know, they'd have, there's one cluster that's great, it's called like barbershops and beauty salons, and you read the descriptions of it, and it's basically, you know, it's like middle-class neighborhoods where people like soul music and like go to barbershops, and high concentrations of them in Montgomery, Alabama, and Tuscaloosa, and Memphis. And you'd read this 2-page description, and it's like, you're just talking about middle-class black people, like, you know, but you couldn't possibly go into Procter & Gamble and say, like, this is how you would market to black people. And so the disconnect between the stuff that was produced for the corporate world that people were trying to shoehorn into politics and how political people thought about, you know, voters never really matched. And, you know, if there's one sort of constant folly, I think, of people trying to innovate with data in politics, it's been kind of too much of a blind reliance on thinking that stuff that works in the consumer world will naturally work in politics, or will work better than what exists in politics. And often, you know, it's just not the case. You know, the challenges are different, and the sort of sensitivities are different, and that's one place where it sort of broke down.
So one thing you don't talk as much about in the book is local politics, and so here at NationBuilder, you know, a lot of our customers are local politicians. Is about, for those who don't know, about 509,000 elected offices in America. So about 1 in 600 people are actually a local elected official. And kind of one of our kind of theories, or theses, I should say, we've seen this prove out, is that, you know, when you're running for president, if you're knocking on a door, name ID is 100%. Everybody knows who's running. It's very hard, though not impossible, but hard to do persuasion at the door. As you get even down to Congress, frankly, when you're knocking on a door, nobody's any idea who's running. And so the ability to do persuasion is much greater because people have no pre-existing opinion. So I'm just curious if you can think a little bit about, tell us about how you think some of this might apply to those, you know, hundreds of thousands of local races.
Yeah, so, you know, I mean, one of the important things about NCEC, for example, was that it turned data into a resource that was sort of universally useful for, in that case, Democrats or their allies running, but the parties would get subscriptions to NCEC data, and if you were running for state legislature, you could use NCEC data to sort through the precincts in your district. And if you were running a, SCIU's operations in a state, you could use it to sort through. And so I think that we're seeing individual level data and some of the statistical modeling based on the micro-targeting stuff starting to be disseminated in the same way where party committees will collect, gather, hygiene a voter file, create some people call synthetic stuff, which are statistical models, micro-targeting stuff, but it's basically adding on to it analysis and then sharing it downward or outward with their candidates. And so, the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee this year did micro-targeting models for 80-something candidates that it had in its targeted districts. And so it became that, if you were both incumbents and challengers, or open seats, and so it became if you were a Democrat running for Congress somewhere, you wanted to win over Steve Israel on your visit to Washington, not only because he would spend money through their IE and give you money and help you raise money, but because you would get the sort of gift of data that you, with your 6-person staff on your congressional race, would have not only no way of developing yourself, but probably very little way of shopping for intelligently, because it can be pretty bewildering to go and try to hire somebody to do statistical modeling if you've never done this before. And I think that what we're going to start to see, and then the other 350 Democrats running for Congress this year got basically generic models. They built a national, so what they did is they built a national model that just predicted partisanship and turnout for everybody in the country, and then they did an oversample in their polls for the 80 districts so they could do something that was specific to the circumstance of those races. I think that we'll start to see that go down through, you guys have a relationship with the Legislative Campaign Committee, right? And party committees will start to treat this type of modeling as an asset that they can share with candidates, where it's one of the ways in which I think parties in the era of super PACs can remain particularly relevant as sort of repositories of data and as the kind of research hubs that can sort through it at scale and share it with candidates. And now through national voter files and everybody, in most places, everybody using the same software interface. I mean, one of the big impediments until the last decade on both sides was that you had a lot of different software vendors, and it became very difficult to synthesize data across platforms. It's become a lot easier, even if people are using different interfaces to access the data. The returning contacts and getting stuff is becoming a lot easier. So I do think that that's going to be one of the areas where we'll probably start to see legislative campaign committees, state legislative caucuses, the National Association of County Executives, will figure out how to create this stuff and share it, and you'll have a sort of culture. And one of the things that the Obama campaign has done that'll have a sort of enduring influence on the new iteration of that Democratic sort of data field advantage is, there were, I just heard the number, I think 2,700 Obama field organizers this year. These were people who ran, their own office somewhere or were regional or whatever. And there was a similar number in 2008. That is the same way that people who worked on Democratic campaigns in the 70s and 80s and 90s were like, where are my NCEC numbers? I don't know. I just landed in Spokane to run a congressional race. I don't know what to do without my NCEC numbers. Now the generation of 24-year-olds who are dropping in to run a county executive race in Spokane are saying, where are my micro-targeting scores? Otherwise, I don't know how to get started. And so I think that to some degree there will be a demand side from a generation, particularly on the left, of people who are doing ground level politics, that this is the currency by which you start thinking about how to run a race. And that'll in many ways drive the marketplace, because that need will have to be satisfied by especially the parties.
So, just to try to kind of pull way back up. So we've been talking a lot about kind of specific techniques and tactics to win races, and putting my progressive hat on for a second. While Obama just won this campaign, if you look at issues, especially economic issues, the country has moved substantially to the right in the last 30 or 40 years, right? Obamacare is a watered-down version of the Republican response to Hillary Care. Tax rates are the lowest they've ever been. We're talking about, do we solve the deficit with 2-to-1 spending cuts versus tax raises, or 3-to-1 spending cuts versus tax raises? So how do you think these tactics apply to the kind of broader shifts in, if you're someone on the left and you actually want to move the dial substantially to the left, sort of in the policies that get enacted? How do you think these tactics relate to those shifts, right? The right, over a 40-year period, sort of was successful in sort of totally changing the ideological landscape. If you're someone that wants to change the ideological landscape, how does this relate?
So great question. Sort of two cautionary notes to start with. I mean, one is everything that I probably have talked about here and certainly write about in the book, both the sort of use of experiments and data, micro-targeting stuff, are all fundamentally about, changing an election at the margins. None of this stuff, makes a unpopular policy popular, or a bad candidate good, or a, good economy bad, or an untrusted party trusted, or any of this stuff. It's all stuff that can allow you to be a lot more efficient about how you allocate your resources, whether that's volunteer time or money, and actually get better effects on mobilization and on registration, starting to on persuasion. So this stuff is sort of, I think, existing apart from the sort of broader, like choice architecture that voters face. And I think that there are real limitations to applying this stuff to governing. I think, sort of Organizing for America, which was the sort of Obama campaign in exile in 2009 and 10, probably came to appreciate this in some form, which is, at the core of organizing for a campaign is asking citizens to do something that's very immediate to them, which is vote, or get your neighbors to vote, or get register to vote, or get somebody to register to vote. But it's never more than 1 or 2 stages from something that you do yourself, which is go and vote, or vote absentee or early vote, or whatever the culture of your place is now. Changing executive branch or legislative branch activity, which is sort of the policy-making sphere. I think there's always this idea, well, it worked in elections, why don't we apply it to governing? Well, because at the core of it is the ask of a citizen is some version of call your member of Congress and ask them to do something, and you look at your member of Congress, you're like, I know how they're going to vote. The factors driving their vote are going to have very little to do with whether they get 20,000 phone calls about this, or there are 60 letters to the editor this weekend. And so often people end up, I think, rather intelligently. I mean, there is community organizing in Washington focused on legislative results. It's called lobbying. But it is relationship building. It relies on having a fair bit of information about people. It's in certain ways, it's the closest manifestation to what good field organizers do. But that's why most people end up focusing when they want to affect legislative results, it's by threatening or rewarding members by showing their electoral clout. And so to the extent that these techniques are pushing policy decisions, it's to some degree because the leverage is being exerted that way. I will say, you obviously mentioned a lot of ways in which the country has moved right. That said, 4 states voted in favor of gay marriage for the first time a couple weeks ago, and that's an example, especially in 3 of them, where there was, and not all 4, there's slightly different sort of techniques and data being used, but you had to put together a new type of coalition. And it was a coalition that didn't previously exist. It was not tethered to a political party. There's not vote history where you can go see everybody who's voted gay in the last 6 elections and just go knock on their doors. It's a pretty sensitive thing to go call a stranger about, so you actually have to have pretty good, well-trained canvassers. And in those states, people use data and use testing to figure out how you build a coalition of support and mobilize it around something that people, until very recently, were not used to talking about in public or in front of strangers, let alone sort of engaging meaningfully. And so I think there are ways in which we see tremendous social change towards the left that have been sustained by the ability to do a type of organizing that relies on good, rich data, statistical modeling. I mean, people come up in each of those states with, a prediction of the likelihood that you were supported marriage or were gay friendly, or just something as simple as so in Minnesota, in particular, Maine did too. One of the big changes this year was they focused their messaging on talking not about sort of civil rights or equality, but talking about marriage. And they thought that this was so they did a lot of messaging research behind that. But a lot of the goal was the idea that they could sort of build relationships with people who are fundamentally conservative by talking about the value of marriage. And part of it was talking to straight people about, do you remember what it was like when you got married, and how much that meant to you, and basically trying to hope that the sort of inclusive attitudes that grow out of them thinking positively about the institution of marriage instead of saying, we shouldn't discriminate against people. The challenge of figuring out who in the electorate is married or single is, now there are ways to do it, but a decade ago that was entirely perplexing. So, figuring out whether somebody is single takes a lot of interesting data work, right? And so it's not something that's on your voter registration record. There's no public database that you can buy of people who are married. And so, people come up with these sort of elaborate formulas of finding people who, and that's even before you try to model people who are gay, right? And so it's like if two people are basically the same age and live together, of the same gender, what assumptions you make about them. And so the ability to engage on really sensitive issues in a meaningful way with people that sort of supported these social changes, it's hard to imagine those things happening the way they have without some form of modern electioneering behind them.
That's really interesting. So I'm going to ask a last question, which is, so you've been using NationBuilder for your book. Those of you who RSVP'd for the event RSVP'd through NationBuilder. So why did you choose to use NationBuilder, and how has it been helpful? So
I feel like since I've talked for the last hour about the cutting edge of political campaigns and organizing, I feel like I'm an underperforming rookie when it comes to using the one political tech and data service I actually pay for. My interest is, basically promoting a book is like I'm more or less a one-man marketing operation here, and at the same time I'm trying to be a one-man reporting and writing operation. And so, my goals were, when I set out to create a website, I had a website for my first book, which was about sushi, that I hired a designer to make. It was a standalone website, and that, it had very limited functionality. It was like a list of places I would be doing events. I had to learn enough HTML to update myself, and, had a bio and a link to some of my stories and a link to an Amazon thing, and that was basically the entirety of it. My goal was, at a basic level, you guys had all the functionality I wanted to be able to build and maintain a relatively sophisticated list that wasn't just collecting people's email addresses. Linking that to social media was useful to me. Having an events sort of interface where we're including people, the ability for people to RSVP, and having that linked up with my list function without any work. So all of that sort of was of great value to me, and I'm going to go write another book after this, and I don't want to treat every book I do as I created a list of people who cared about this thing, and it's a stack of email addresses, and I need to figure out how to turn it into something for the next one. And so I started thinking a sort of longer-term way about how to sustain like an ongoing interest in what I do for people and keep that relationship alive. Like a campaign, like, so
not like a campaign.
no, right, and so figuring out how in the fallow period when I don't have something to sell all of you, I still know who you are, and hopefully can find out some sort of way to maintain a relationship. That said, selling a book is as much as I'd like to think of my, people as part of a community, it is a sort of fundamentally different exercise. But it's, I do appreciate especially having done this book. I have a lot of ideas for things I wish I had been able to do, because I spend all my days now talking to people who do really clever testing, and now I'm thinking about all the ways I should have targeted single people. I should have modeled all my single friends, and part of the limitations are that I don't have a director of new media or regional field director that I can have do that for me.
So I want to take a few questions from out there. So if you can say your name and what you do before your question, try to sort of yell it loud so we can hear. So Greg, was that a hand raise?
Yeah. My name's Greg Cohn. I have a mobile startup that I'm sort of interested in.
What's it called, Greg?
It's called Burner. Thanks, Kevin. But this is more of a political question, and just kind of going back to a comment you made earlier about sort of having in mind some of the sort of value of analysis in the sort of first half of the decade. My memory of 2005, 2006, it was sort of the year of George Lakoff, right? It was this whole debate about framing and how the right was doing a better job of message development and really message discipline and delivery through the whole Fox News megaphone whole deal. And I'm kind of curious, we talked a lot about, kind of mobilization and getting people to actually vote. I perceive, both parties in general as sort of doing a pretty poor job overall marketing in a sustained way, independently of the actual voting behavior on election day. And I'm just curious as to how that's becoming quantified and sort of part of this sort of set of thinking.
Yeah. So the question was about how, in the 2005-2006 period, there was a lot of focus on George Lakoff and sort of the Democrats' language messaging deficit, and how that stuff fits into some of the stuff I've been talking about. Part of it is that, at least in the election context, there are ultimately very few voters who are persuadable, right? Different pollsters, analysts have different numbers, but somewhere between 8 and 12% of this electorate's opinions were ever up for grabs over the course of this year.
So can I just elaborate on that?
Yeah.
I'm sort of thinking over maybe a longer time,
yeah.
In the sense that, the amount of money that was spent on this election cycle was more than Sony or Mercedes-Benz or BMW combined spends in a year, right? And so in terms of marketing their brand, they do influence, points over time, from a pure perception.
But they're ultimately moving. There's a much smaller goal of market share there. At some point, at the end, campaigns care about the choice of, it's a binary choice, and there are ultimately very few people who could have gone either way. And so, so much of the focus is actually on engaging non-voters in a meaningful way to get them to vote. I do think that there is a sort of pathology in politics, and the left in the 05-06 period felt it acutely and actually used it to good effect, which is always thinking that the other side is better at everything than you are, which I think is part of it is a sort of basic paranoia that drives people in politics, because some of the stuff is opaque, right? So Democrats think Fox News is all powerful, and Republicans think Acorn is all powerful. And the other part of it is that the whole sort of donor investor class tends to respond to some idea of there is a huge structural imbalance between these two sides. So unless we throw a lot of money at our side, we're doomed to be a perpetual minority party. And so we are going to see, just in the same way that the 04 election was sort of mirror image of this one, I think in many respects, I anticipate that 2013 and 14 will be sort of a mirror image of 2005 and 6, where this election, people are, I think, coming to appreciate was one that, Maury was saying, it was decided by tactics and technique, but clearly imbalance in tactics and technique and skill contributed to this outcome. And the question for Republicans is what they do to get back. Lakoff happens to be a sort of remarkable self-promoter, and he was writing op-eds. A lot of the most important work that happened on the left in groups like the Analyst Institute was taking place entirely in secret because people thought of it as a competitive advantage. So I think, Democrats didn't see any downside in saying George Lakoff came and talked to the Senate caucus about how you should talk like a daddy and not a mommy or whatever that stuff was. But like people who are doing this research, were doing experiments, had no interest in getting into the papers. And what there was that was important was institution building and creating institutions that live longer than a single campaign, that don't reside in a party, because parties tend to turn over just as frequently as national parties, as frequently as campaigns do, but that were built for collaboration. And the big thing about the Analyst Institute and the New Organizing Institute and Catalyst and a whole bunch of other things that sort of blossomed during this period where Democrats were afraid that Karl Rove had unlocked the secrets of politics and they would be a minority party forever if they didn't catch up, was that people started sharing and collaborating instead of competing. And that's sort of the most important thing that happened then. And I think the big question for Republicans will be, can consultants put aside their business interests to collaborate on research, and can organizations that sort of thrive on having a membership list like National Right to Life or the NRA be willing to collaborate, sharing data or sharing research in a way that may force them to have to loosen a little bit of the control of the knowledge of who their members are that they use to scare candidates into taking them seriously.
So I think we have time for one more question. We have one?
Sure. So
Sorry.
Okay. Hi, I'm Ben Robinson. I'm a first-year public policy student at USC. And so my question is, why do you think that? So there's an article in the New York Times recently about how the president in the election re-elect, basically talked to a committee of behavioral scientists. And I thought it was really funny when I saw an article on Fox News' opinion site that said Obama shrinks. So let's me to say my question is, why do you think that Republicans or conservatives are so much less likely to take social science seriously in the wake of elections, especially in the wake of an election where they lost badly? You were talking about Project Orca, the software tool, and how horrible it was. Like, they're trying to get back into data, but also there's this other wing that Democrats seem to be using a lot better and a lot more. Why do you think there's such a disconnect?
Yeah, I mean, so, if that sort of, as I was describing, like if the big innovations from 2000 to 2005 or 6 are coming from the corporate world, and the big innovations from 2006 onwards are coming from academia, are sort of lazy shorthand of where each of these parties has their sort of like professional sympathies and also the biggest sort of social networks. It sort of makes sense that Republicans would sort of unlock commercial marketing and its benefits for campaigns first, and that you have now dozens, if not hundreds, of academics who are particularly interested in experiments or sort of advanced methodological work. These are people who sort of come out of in some form or another, descendants of those two guys at Yale I talked about at the beginning, in political science and in behavioral psychology and economics, who want to go out and do real-world testing. There are very few professors or graduate students, and so those, there are graduate students, dozens of them all across the country now, who want to go and do an experiment with the League of Conservation Voters or a state Democratic Party, either because they want to publish it or because they want to be part of this sort of research culture that's making party campaigns on the left smarter, or there's actually money in it for them to be paid as a consultant to do it, or they just believe in the cause. And there are very few graduate students who want to go to experiments for the NRA. And there is a sort of, there's a talent issue there. We can come up with all of our reasons why, grad students like Democrats more than Republicans, but it's turning into a problem because, and I guess this is sort of good note to leave it on, all of the moments where campaigns get smarter is because the generally insular world of political professionals opens up in some form or another to people who have other skills or expertise or backgrounds or just other ways of approaching problems. And so whether that's people with private sector, commercial marketing expertise, people with tech, like real tech expertise, people who've solved empirical problems in the academic world, those are the moments that you challenge assumptions, that you sort of have disruption. And there are right now far fewer people in the sort of high level decision-making positions in Republican politics who are interacting with people who are not other political professionals. And that's just a huge problem, because if you don't, you end up in that sort of cycle of the campaigns, which is, yeah, you're going to do the same thing over and over again. And the resumes of people who worked on the Obama campaign in every department, in digital and tech and analytics and data, in their media planning, tons of people who had never worked in campaigns before and may or may not ever work in campaigns again. And that's a big problem. And if there are sort of costs to, Republican social policies or attitudes that are sort of alienating, people in academia or people in the tech world, they're actually like real world practical consequences in the way you run your campaigns.
Well, I thought it was a really interesting conversation. Thank you so much, Sasha. Thanks everybody for being here. Sasha will be around for a little bit. We've got wine, we've got cheese, we've got politically interested people.
Thanks, Jeff.
Yeah, me too.
Yes, John.
My undergrad? Yeah. University of Pittsburgh. I mean, I've only been out here for like a limited amount of time.